Picture with me, if you will, the perfect person of faith. The person we believe most embodies what it means to be a Christian, a disciple of Jesus Christ. Now, maybe some of us have met people like that before, so it's not that hard to picture, and then again, maybe some of us have not. So, let's just try and picture this person together. Ready? Okay, let's start at the top. The hair. Now, we can only imagine that a perfect person of faith would have short, well-kept hair. Just kidding, it clearly has to be long. You know what? Maybe not, but at least we know they're not bald, right? Okay, let's move on from the hair thing. Clearly a touchy subject for people. How about dress? How would this perfect person of faith dress? Well, we don't want to have anything too pretentious, too much, but we also don't want to have anything too little either. We want to, on the one hand, be able to say, I care about this temple that God gave me, but not that I care too much. Right. Okay, how about tattoos? We can imagine a couple of key placed Jesus fish, but maybe a scripture lesson or something, but maybe not too much more than that. I know what you're thinking. What kind of car do they drive? Toyota. Kind of coffee, lightly roasted. Relationship status, complicated. Computer, PC. DC or Marvel, we're not going to dignify that one with a response. Actually, now that we think about it, now that we get into it a little bit, we recognize that it's actually not as easy as we thought to picture the perfect person of faith. After all, faith is much more a matter of heart than it is appearance. Though if we're honest, sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we have these perfect pictures of people in our mind, and we hold up people as paragons of perfection, whether past or present, but in the end, we end up perplexed. People that we think ought to be perfect, and yet when we actually get to know them, recognize that, like us, they're not. The truth is, there's only ever been one perfect person of faith. And it had nothing to do with the way he looked. As we too often forget, friends, being a person of faith is not about whether we have short hair or long hair or no hair at all. It's not about whether we can say long prayers. It's not about how many times we make it to the worship service. In the end, being a person of faith is about how we live our lives. Not on Sunday mornings, but every day. And if we're honest, all of us struggle from time to time to be faithful. The good news, as our scripture lesson for today reminds us, that even the most imperfect among us, even those of us who struggle the most, can find our way if we can figure out how to do it together. And so today, on this day when we pause to celebrate the birthday of our country, a nation which has struggled of late to recognize how to live faithfully in this world. On this day, we pause to turn from the founding fathers to the father of our faith as we hear a story about the nature of faithfulness itself. Now, full disclosure, this is one of the most complicated and provocative stories in all of Scripture. It's one that we are all left scratching our heads thinking, what gives in this story? That we don't quite understand it. It basically, for those who weren't paying attention, goes something like this. We have Abraham, one of the founding fathers of our faith. Abraham, the person from whom all of the branches of faiths developed, that is, Christianity, Jews, and Muslims, all came from Abraham. Abraham, the father of our faith, who we learned last week is not exactly a candidate for Father of the Year, having sent his first son Ishmael out into the wilderness on his own. Abraham hears a voice from heaven saying, "Abraham," to which he responds, "Here I am." A good, faithful response. It says, "Abraham, take your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on the mountain that I show you." Do you hear? Go and take your only son, never mind Ishmael, take your only son, Isaac, whom you love, on a mountain and offer him there as a burnt offering. In other words, go and kill your son. Gulp. And while we might imagine if we were in the story, might have a few questions to ask, story just says that the next morning Abraham went. That he brought 2 young men, a donkey, plenty of wood, Isaac, whom he loved, and a knife and fire. And as they're walking along, we hear Isaac say to his father, "Father," to which he responds, "Here I am." A nice, faithful response. Isaac takes a look around and says, "Well, I see the wood, and I see the knife and the fire, but where's the lamb for the offering?" To which Abraham says, "The Lord will provide the lamb, my son." It's a little like in those old horror films when the cannibal says to the young couple, "I'd love to have you for dinner." They make their way to the mountain. And Abraham builds an altar out of the wood, and he binds Isaac, and he places them there, and he pulls out the knife slowly, and he raises it above his head, and just as he's ready to strike down, he hears a voice, "Abraham, Abraham," to which he responds, "Here I am." A good, faithful response. And God says, "Do not lay your hand on the boy. Don't let any harm come to him now that I know that you fear God. Now that I know you are faithful." And so then Abraham looks and he sees a ram who is there. He takes the ram and he sacrifices the lamb, and then presumably they go upon their merry way, though we can only imagine this would have put a slight strain in the father-son relationship from that point on. That's the story. The good, the bad, and the ugly, with an emphasis on the last 2. It is a complicated and provocative story that leaves us scratching our head, wondering, what is that about? It's a story that almost all of us have heard in some form or another, but which almost none of us understands. It's a story that people throughout the history of our faith have struggled to try and make some sense of. And in some ways, that's the beauty of it. You see, part of the beauty of our faith, though it can be frustrating at times, is that it requires interpretation. That there's not one way to do it right. There's not just one interpretation of Scripture, there are multiple interpretations, and we, as a people of faith, are charged with figuring it out together. But we do get to figure it out together. That's part of what it means to be a part of a church, near or far. That we come together to figure it out. And so today, we'll practice. Though typically we offer one possible interpretation, here today we are going to offer three. Three possibilities in the hope that one of them might hit us where we need it this morning. Possibility one, the view that we will call the traditional view. This is the one which says that Abraham represents the perfect person of faith. That this is the perfect act of faith. It's the view of Kierkegaard and others who throughout history have looked at Abraham and said, look at what he was able to do. He was willing to give up that which was most important to him for the sake of his faith. That he was willing to give up his son. The son whom God had promised God would build all of his progeny off of. That all of his offspring would number in the multitudes, would build great nations. That this son whom they were so happy to receive that they named him Laughter. And he was willing to let him go when asked. This is a view which asks each and every one of us to take a hard look in the mirror and to ask ourselves, what would we be willing to let go for the sake of the world? And even if it's not our children, and let's be really clear, it shouldn't be, we do recognize that each of us have things in our lives that we hold on to, or perhaps that hold on to us, that are keeping us from connecting to God or to others. Perhaps this is a call to let them go. Sometimes we have to lose our life in order to gain it. Of course, there are challenges with this point of view. Not the least of which is that it paints an awfully strange picture of God. Yes, we know it's just a test, but kind of a messed up test that makes us wonder about this God of grace, this God whom we have known for God's love. The traditional response to that worry would be that God was about to place all of the history of the people Israel on this one man, that God needed to make sure that this man was faithful, but even then, it just doesn't sit right with us. Fortunately, it's not the only view. Here's possibility 2. This is what we might call the Christian view. It's the one that Christians for the last 2,000 years have read back into this story. They look back, they build upon the traditional view to say that it was the natural fulfillment of that sacrifice on Mount Moriah, that God had Jesus, and Jesus was sacrificed there. That Jesus Christ was the ultimate fulfillment of what happened. That in the end, yes, Abraham did his best, but he could not be as faithful as God. That in the end, only God is faithful. And there's something to that. There are some nice parallels in the story. It is certainly a complicated father-son relationship. It's on the third day that these things happen. The wood is placed on Isaac's back as they walk toward the mountain, like the cross placed on Jesus's back. But in the end, it still feels like a stretch. And this interpretation is not without its significant challenges. Sure, it allows Christians to take a look back at Scripture and see it as a whole narrative, to recognize that all of Scripture in some ways points towards Christ's redeeming work in this world, and that sits well with us until we recognize what that does to the people to whom this work was originally written. That not only does it ignore the context in which this story was written, it ignores the people to whom it was written. In this case, the Jews. And ignorance is often the first step towards atrocity. We recognize this from our own history. 70 years ago, the ignorance which led to atrocity happened to the Jews. We might ask ourselves, where might our ignorance lead today? Fortunately, there is another view, possibility 3. This is the view which says that far from being an example of perfect faith, this is a warning against blind faith. It's a warning against faith without thought. It's a reminder of what happens to us when we preface law over love, something that Jesus reminded us over and over again about. See, in this story, Abraham is told as a lesson. The test is a lesson trying to get Abraham to not just blindly walk into injustice. Yes, it's a little passive-aggressive on God's part, but God was trying to do something new here and helping Abraham to think before he acts, to take a step back and to think, is this what God calls me to do? Does it make sense in relationship to the rest of my faith? Would a loving God ask me to do this? In this point of view, this is a warning to us to not be so caught up in the appearance of faith that we forget what faith itself looks like. We are not called to do harm. Not by word, not by tweet, not by action. And if we who claim faith are causing harm to others, we need to take a step back and to reevaluate. God does not call us to do harm. God calls us to love. And when we take a look at that which we are doing and recognize it is causing this world harm, we need to pause and reevaluate because it is not faithful. And so there we have it, 3 views. Are there other possibilities? Absolutely an infinite number, but these are the ones we chose for today, hoping that one might offer that living water for our thirsty souls. Tomorrow we may awake and find ourselves in need of another interpretation, but today's worries are enough for today. Do you see the beauty of Scripture? The beauty of our faith is that we don't have it all figured out. That it's always incomplete, that none of us have this right. There's never been a perfect person of faith except one, and we killed him. There's never been a perfect person of faith, but friends, God has stuck with us. That's the promise of grace. That there's nothing we can do or say to lose the love of God. The promise of grace is that we don't have to be perfect to be loved. And fortunately for us, the people who came before us, both in the long history of our faith and in the short history of our church, the imperfect people who came before us cared enough to share what they had learned about God. And we should too. The truth is, there's no such thing as a perfect person of faith. There is only a person of faith. Short-haired, long-haired, and sometimes no hair at all. We don't have all the answers. But each and every day we are called to wake up and to take that next step towards perfect love of God and neighbor. The good news is that even when we fail, even when we can't quite find our way, even when we are more down than up, at least we know that, like all of the people who came before us, we don't walk alone. Friends, we may not be perfect, but we are more perfect together than we are apart. Thanks be to God. Amen.